So if you have any ideas, let me know. Please, I can always use ideas. Dr. Ann McKnight is the executive director of the Bowen Center and has been accepting this challenge for almost 7 years now. She's spoken at this meeting almost yearly on a variety of subjects and speaks regularly at the Fall Symposium and the Spring Conference. To say the least, she has much to say about Bowen theory and its usefulness in understanding the human as a science. Last spring, she, among others, attended the International Conference on Bowen Systems Theory in Hong Kong and was struck how much hearing the ideas stimulated by Dr. Bowen in his lifetime have traveled to a number of countries, and each area of the globe is complemented by their connections. Using these ideas in their lives and work. It was a mind-blowing experience, and she and others are looking forward to the next international meeting in Sweden in 2020. So be alert for the event, and we hope to see you there. Dr. McKnight will be talking about the differences between attachment theory and Bowen theory. Often at these meetings in particular, we have people in the audience or receiving these presentations through the media by other means who are not clear about what Bowen theory really is. Dr. McKnight's objective is to try to describe Dr. Bowen's research in defining a self in one's family of origin, allowing one to become more independent in one's life course while staying in meaningful contact with the emotional relationship system in the family. It is a constant balancing act, but most helpful when the family anxiety is running the show. It is sometimes useful to describe, by comparison, Dr. Bowen's work with a more popular idea to be able to see better Bowen theory. Tonight, Dr. McKnight will be presenting the topic, the developmental lifespan of the child. What are the differences between Bowlby's attachment theory and Bowen's family systems theory? Let's welcome Dr. McKnight.
Thank you. And just so that you're aware, we are broadcasting this on Facebook. So we find we get, we multiply our audience on Facebook, although, you know, some of them only spend 5 minutes. So, and we've had technology problems this week, so I don't like to do this, but I'm going to have to read my slides off the front projector and not off of the monitor up here. So I apologize. I think that won't be as as polite to you. But you know, a few years ago, I was intrigued by attachment theory. And so I spent a whole kind of semester studying attachment theory because I wanted to better understand what the difference between Bowen family systems theory and attachment theory. Now, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Bowen theory? And how many of you are familiar with attachment theory? And how many of you came with your friend? So let me just say there's this interface that attachment theory, which I will talk about, you will discover is at CVS in the Hallmark cards. That is attachment theory there. But also, Bowen used the word unresolved emotional attachment to talk about the way that each of us is connected to our original family and have not totally sorted through who we are in relation to our parents. And he called that unresolved emotional attachment. So there's words that are used interchangeably that mean something a little bit different. So I did this exercise for myself to some degree to try to describe and define the differences between Bowlby's ideas and Bowen's ideas. So this is a pretty small group tonight, and I would really like to hear some discussion from you and some questions. As I said, the technology. Okay, so I already said this. You know, the predominant theoretical paradigm in mental health. There's lots of different types of mental health counseling, like CBT, but the predominant theoretical underpinning has to do with attachment theory. And I will talk about that. How does the child develop, and in what way does the relationship between the mother and child and the mother's correct, secure attachment to the child predict how the child will develop and preclude psychiatric or other kinds of problems in adulthood. So there is this idea out there in the world that in order to grow up to be a healthy, normal adult, you have to have the right kind of mother who's been nurturing, supportive, loving, unconditional love, and very attentive to you. And so that's a very different idea from Bowen, and I will try to talk about that today. So what was interesting to me about Bowen and Bowlby is they were contemporaries. They almost lived parallel lives. Bowlby was a psychoanalyst in London, and Bowen was a psychiatrist here who worked in the Menninger Clinic and then came to Georgetown University. So as far as I know, they never met. But that's kind of amazing to me because they had such parallel ideas and development. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. So they were both Bowlby and Bowen started out as psychoanalysts. As I said, Bowen worked with Carl Menninger at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, and Bowlby worked at the Psychoanalytic Training Institute in London. And so they were both grounded in Freudian theory. But what was interesting in terms of the parallel development with them is they both began, so Freud had these ideas like the edible complex, different ideas about father-daughter incest that were sort of philosophically grounded in his ideas of what could happen. Both Bowlby and Bowen began to study clinical families. So they weren't so much in the philosophical side of mental health. They were thinking about or observing what happened in the clinical world. They also, another parallel between Bowlby and Bowen was they began to study evolutionary theory. And they began to ask, how do you understand the human as developing over millennia in, for instance, mother-child interactions. So they weren't so much in the philosophical part. They were in the observational clinical work in terms of developing their theories. And they were both interested in relationships. And so those were areas that they had in common. So this is Bowlby as a young man. He began to study juvenile delinquents, that's what they were called at the time, in London. And he wrote this book, 44 Juvenile Delinquents. And he began to investigate their families. And that was one of the observations that he used as a clinical basis for trying to investigate further mother-child interactions. So this is Bowen. He was trained, I've already talked about it, he's a physician. And when he was in World War II, he was a surgeon, and but he observed the soldiers in the war, and he said, I think if I can be helpful to humans, it's not going to be as a surgeon, it's going to be trying to understand mental health better. So when he came back, he decided to train as a psychoanalyst. So what I think is hard to understand is that in the 40s, when these two guys were being trained, Freudian theory was the predominant theory at the time. And like today, we don't know all that many people who've been psychoanalyzed, but it was a really engaging, it was the first effort to try to understand the human psyche. And Freud had these ideas. He came out of Germany, he went to London, and he became very popular in the United States. Many socialites were being psychoanalyzed. He was the first person that created this idea that a dialogue between a patient and a clinician could help to cure psychiatric problems. Before that, there were all kinds of, cold baths and shutting people in cages, but this was the first. Freud was the first person that said, let's talk to the patient and try to understand what's happening. So he was a real innovator and was very influential and famous at the time. And to not be a Freudian at that time was like you were really out of the crowd, like very much an outsider. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Bowlby, and then I'll talk about Bowen. I think probably most of you know a little more about Bowen than you know about Bowlby, although I don't know, Bowlby's been studied in great detail. So Bowlby was an ethologist, and he studied evolutionary psychology. So what he had, so have you heard of Lorenz? Everybody heard of Lorenz? Lorenz Arabia. Lorenz was one of the first students of imprinting. And so he first studied, if you take a duck and it's raised by a swan, then that duck will follow the swan. That was Lorenz. So he got interested in it. What is the nature of the mother-child relationship in nature, in the natural world? And also Henry Harlow was at the University of Wisconsin, and he was the one who, everybody I think has heard of this, who studied the monkeys, and they took the young monkeys. This would not go over today, but they said, they looked at what the young monkey was attracted to. Was it the terry cloth mother? Was it the one who could give him the food? And what Harlow discovered, that it was more important for the young monkey to have kind of a warm, nurturing experience, more important than food. And that's very different than Freud. Freud said the basic maternal caregiving, the basic instinct is based upon the mother feeds the child. And these researchers were beginning to investigate that and better understand how that worked. So he began natural studies of human attachment. So this is from he wrote a number of books. One of them was called Attachment. But one of the things that happened with Bowlby is that his reference point, although he was interested in evolutionary theory, he was interested in studying the natural world. I mean, he extended Freudian theory in that way. He was interested in studying clinical families. What he says is, throughout this inquiry of attachment, my frame of reference has been psychoanalysis. The psyche remains the most serviceable and the most used of any present-day psychopathology. So he's looking at the individual psyche, and he's thinking about psychopathology, which really originated from Freud's thinking about it. So So the differences between Freud and Bowlby. So the way that Freud understood childhood development was that he asked adult patients what their memories were about their childhoods, which is different from what Bowlby did. What Bowlby did was he actually studied mothers and infants and their mothers. So Freud was trying to reconstruct the ideas from the kind of psychoanalysis that was going on, that he was conducting. He was trying to understand how the child developed from the adult. The other thing that Bowlby, what he called, I don't want to get too complicated, but he had a secondary drive, and that had to do with the mother feeding the child. That part of attachment was the mother's being a resource as nutritional. So Bowlby developed a very different idea about attachment from Freud, even though his theoretical framework was Freudian theory. He said that attachment is a natural evolutionary process which protects the child as an infant and as it grows up. So that if the child, so that it is a regulating force between the child and the mother, and that it can go back and forth, reciprocal. So that, for instance, if the mother is too far away from the child cries and the mother returns. If the mother sees herself as too far away from the child, she becomes anxious and thinks she needs to check on the child. So that the child is regulating the mother and the mother is responding to the child. And that is, he thought of that as an evolutionary trait because that would help ensure the survival of the baby from external threats, from other members of the social system, just in general, that was an important regulating mechanism. So he said it was a biologically based desire for proximity between the mother and the child that arose through natural selection. And so the human, I think by both Bowlby and Bowen, was considered to be, have descended from many other species, and that he could observe this in, primate, infants, all kinds of other mammalian species. So anyway, I don't know that I need to go into this, but Freud and Bowlby had different sort of theoretical frameworks for thinking about the variation in maternal care. So so this is just important, that it was an evolutionary adaptation in other species other than the human. And it maintained attachment, maintained proximity to the mother for protection. And reactions of fear, anger, or happiness regulated the distance to the mother. So that, for instance, if you look at animal studies, when everything is calm with young primates or young monkeys, the mother will allow the child to explore. If there is a threat, the mother will pull the child back, so that when the child is relaxed and the mother is relaxed and happy, it allows the proximity to extend. When there's anxiety or danger in the environment, the mother will, either the baby will cry, the mother will come, or the mother will come and get the infant. So that this is Bowlby thought of this as an evolutionary mechanism. So, according to Bowlby, that the child was born with systems ready for attachment. That is, this reaction of fear, happiness, You know, that you look at a gurgling baby. I mean, it's like a magnet. You know, people just come to it. The family comes to it. The mother comes to it. The baby is, you know, is upset and crying. There will be a caretaker that approaches. So people say, this is more Bowen than Bowlby. People say that the poor, innocent, helpless baby is just at the mercy of everybody. When really, if you look at the social system, the baby is organizing the family to take care of it. You know, how many people just want to get up every 3 hours in the night and feed the baby? You know, the baby has a lot of power in that family. So Bowlby's idea was that now, this is where I want you just to think about the kind of parents you have, or if you have children, the kind of parent you want it to be. So Bowlby says, give the child as much as he or she, I mean he says he, seems to want. The child can self-regulate when the mother is receptive to her child's signals and is responsive. So what does that tell you? The child is going to tell you what the child needs. And that if the mother is too anxious and the mother is not taking cues from the child about what the child needs, the mother can give too much mothering, and that can be a problem. But if she's sufficiently attentive and responsive, that child will have exactly what it needs. So, does that sound like Dr. Spock? Or so the thing about Bowlby is that his idea of attachment, and you know, I had a book, I think it weighed 20 pounds, it was this big, about people who had written articles on attachment theory. I mean, this is very widely studied. But attachment theory is about, it is a dyadic relationship. You know, where is the father? You know, this is not a system. It is the mother responds to the baby, and the baby gives cues to the mother as to how the mother should respond. It's a caregiver, the mother caregiver and the child. And I don't know, he developed these ideas, and I'll talk about Mary Ainsworth in a minute. But the first, after he studied the juvenile delinquents and looked at their families, the way he came to his ideas is he studied infants who were being separated from their mothers when the mother went into the hospital to have another child. And so then he looked at the range of, you know, how did the child cope with that, and what was the response of the mother, and then looking at those, the separation and then the return of the child to the mother. So what Bowlby, if this is sort of the take-home message, what Bowlby looks at is the style of parenting, the style of parenting of the mother. And what Bowen looks at, and I will go into this in a minute, is he looks at the intensity of the relationship. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. So Bowlby first, so this has some clinical implications. So Bowlby first developed this idea that there's secure attachment. And what that meant is what I've been talking about, is that the mother was attentive and responsive to the signals of the child to distress. And there was this equilibrium, this reciprocity, where the mother attended to the baby and the baby responded to the mother. And that gave the appropriate amount of attachment to make the child secure. So Bowlby developed this idea of secure attachment. Have you all heard of that? So, okay. So he developed the idea of secure attachment. That's the right kind of attachment. So the mother is responsive, the mother is attentive, the mother reads the baby's cues correctly, and they have a good time together. Mary Ainsworth followed him. This is not a very good picture of her, but she studied two populations, one in Baltimore and the other in Uganda. And you know what, there was a protocol of the strange situation procedure was the protocol. So they had the children in Uganda. I mean, she was studying a more rural culture. And when the baby was removed, then they studied, when the mother left, they studied the reaction of the baby. And she said, well, you know, not all these babies have secure attachments. You know, some of them have difficult times of separating. And so she made these categories, she developed these categories of which were added to Bowlby's original idea of the anxious, avoidant, insecure, the anxious, resistance, insecure, and the disorganized, disoriented reactions. And as you might guess, that was not a happy situation. So she's talking about pathological attachment. And that became part of the whole theory, was woven into the whole theory of attachment. That you could have secure attachment, but then there were these other more problematic, where the baby wasn't sure or the child wasn't sure whether the mother would come back, or the mother wasn't clear about the caretaking. So these are others. So where this ends up is in trauma. And there's a huge amount of discussion about trauma today. So what Bowlby says is, when we examine Freud's views on the factors that are causative of the neuroses and adult disturbances, we find that they always center on the concept of trauma. So how, this is a test, guys. How does trauma, how, according to Bowlby, does trauma develop? Yes? From the lack of the attachment. Yeah, the original lack of the correct attachment. And that, you know, trauma is a very big conversation today. I mean, there's trauma like in Afghanistan, but there's also, so what he begins to talk about is maternal deprivation. And they need to have a warm, intimate, continuous relationship between the mother and the child, in which both find satisfaction and enjoyment, and not to do so may have significant and irreversible mental health consequences. So Bowlby very much puts mental health problems and disturbances into that original problematic connection between the mother and the child. We have reached the conclusion that a loss of a mother figure, either by itself or in combination with other variables yet to be clearly identified, is capable of generating responses and processes that of the greatest interest to psychopathology. I mean, you know what psychopathology is. It's psychiatric problems in adulthood. So a young child's experience of an encouraging, supportive, and cooperative mother, and a little later father, gives him a sense of worth, a belief in the helpfulness of others, and a favorable model on which to build future relationships. Now, this is not to say that supportive, and warm and nurturing parents aren't useful. But what do you do with someone like Obama?
Make him president.
You know, I mean, his mother would not have probably fit, Bowlby's description of warm, supportive, loving, intimate relationship. I mean, she was all over the place. And his father pretty much, I mean, his grandmother, I think, saved him. But but that's a family systems idea. This is not about the dyadic mother-child relationship. So, there are, well, I'm going into Bowen. So this idea that warm, loving, intimate, supportive relationships will lead to adult mental health. And not to have it leads to psychopathology. It comes out of Bowlby and is, I think, very much a part of the mental health world today. What's your problem? Well, your mother didn't pay attention to you or something. So this is, I think what I'm trying to say here is that Bowlby kept at least one foot in Freudian theory, and then he did some very interesting other kinds of studies. I want to leave time for discussion. So what is attachment therapy? It is the discussion of, with a therapist, about one's traumas or dilemmas with maladaptive mothering. That is, this is the relationship, and it's talking about it's trying to work out in the relationship with the therapist the dilemmas one experienced early on. And there's a lot of talk these days about, toxic mothers, all kinds of problematic mothers. So these are people who are extremely well known, dominate either the field of research on mother-child interactions in animal studies, or John Gottman is probably the most famous family therapist in the country. Okay, so now Bowen. So Bowen came out of his psychoanalytic training with this idea of symbiosis. And he said, that the child couldn't adequately separate from the mother in terms of the correct developmental trajectory. That the symbiosis would start in the womb, where the child was totally dependent, and then there would be a symbiotic relationship as the baby developed. His idea originally was that, a child could get stuck in that symbiosis and would not develop autonomy that the child needed to go into the world and developed. He had a grant at NIMH where he hospitalized families of schizophrenics, and he studied families, and out of that research project, he developed his theory. So when he first started his research project, he hospitalized mothers and schizophrenic children. But after the first year, he said, wait a minute, this is not correct. We have to revise this. Where are the fathers? The fathers play a role in how the family operates. And you can't simply, he got the symbiosis out of Freudian theory, but you can't simply look at the mother and child. You have to include the father. And the fathers, so what was important was the father's relationship with the mother in relation to the child. That was his original idea. And then he developed the idea early on in the research project that the family was an emotional unit. Now, what did that mean? That meant that the interactions in the family, including the grandparents, were instrumental in how the mother and father interacted, the mother's capacity to mother her child. So, for instance, let's say you have a mother who's not talking to her family, she has a child, she doesn't have any emotional support, that will affect her. I mean, in our lingo, we call that cutoff. That will affect, let's say she's run away from home and she's taken her baby and she says, I can't handle my family. That will affect, her isolation will affect her capacity to mother that child, to be a resource to that child, partly because she doesn't have the resources herself. So he thought of this as an emotional unit, and that you cannot simply look at the way this operates without seeing the father's relationship with his family, the mother's relationship with her family, the kinds of resources that are being provided, the kind of support, the kind of, that the human, I think he came to believe, existed in early times in a multi-generational unit, in a tribe or a village, where you had your sister to come and help you, or you sent the 2-year-old to play with his cousins while you took care of the baby, and that if you isolated the mother from the rest of the unit, that it put her in a vulnerable position in order of taking care of the child. So these are all reciprocal relationships. So what Bowen did is he thought of as the human family as one social unit that was reflective of many social units that were organized in somewhat different ways in other parts of the natural world. So, for instance, we just had a symposium where we had Dr. Thomas Seeley from Cornell, who came and talked about the bee colony. That's a social unit. And the individual bees have a relationship to the way the social unit is organized. So once you begin to think of the human as a social creature that has an important environment in the family unit, you can begin to see, well, what happens when the matriarch in the elephant troop or herd, what do you call it, is killed? How do the rest of the elephants organize or don't organize, or so anyway, so from Bowen's point of view, what makes the difference in how a child develops? And he said, I think one of the important factors is the level of anxiety in the family. That is, how capable is a family of managing the stressors it faces and find problem-solving techniques or ways of solving those problems so that the functions of the family are maintained. And when the family, the father's unemployed, the mother dies, there's a number of things that can happen in families that can destabilize the family and affect the caretaking possibilities, the capabilities of the mother. And then he talked about the level of differentiation, and that's a very complicated idea. But what he's really talking about is how much is this family capable of working together toward the ends that the family should fulfill. And that is to provide resources for the family to live, to take care of children if there are children, and to face the threats from the environment. How much is the family able to work as individuals, cooperatively, collaboratively, to solve those problems? And what he said is that there's a range. You know, some families can't do that for a variety of reasons, and some families do it exceedingly well. And, you know, he wasn't making judgments about people. He simply was saying there's a variation. So the families vary in the levels of anxiety they experience and the levels of capacity to solve the problems the family faces. So he said that symptoms develop, which Bowlby would call psychopathology. Symptoms develop, like in people in the family, when the family as a whole cannot handle the anxiety. So he's talking about a system and not about an individual. Do you have questions about that?
Lots. The loss of the family capacity
Right.
to handle anxiety.
Right. So, for instance, let's say a family is just bumping along just fine, and the father loses his job, or the mother loses her job, but let's say it's the father. You know, then the father, the family doesn't have sufficient income to do what they've been doing all along. The mother becomes anxious. The child reacts to that anxiety. You know, then the family starts focusing on the child. Then the father gets upset with the mother because she's not happy about the finance. You know, that can all spiral. And that anxiety in the family can end up with Johnny being diagnosed with a learning disability. Yes?
Now, I noticed in the expression you just articulated now, the father's anxiety, for example, went through the mother, was with and concerned the mother. And I saw that also in the first depiction that you had of Bowen's theory. The father, you had a single arrow. I thought there were many of them, and perhaps it wasn't appropriate to put all of them in. But with the consistency of that depiction and your expression just now, I wanted to raise the question, if that's what you mean, that you're still articulating transference or focus on the mother.
Could you say that again? You mean the father, I'm sorry, I'm not.
The father is becoming unhappy with the mother. The mother is becoming anxious because of the father, and in two expressions now from my vision, it's still the mother primarily affecting the child. Is that what you mean?
That was Bowen's viewpoint.
Okay.
You know, that Bowen's, you know, and today, this is a different time, but, you know, he would say biologically, especially with young children, that the mother is probably crucial in how the children, how the relationship develops with the children.
So
But
for last follow-up, that might change as the children grow older?
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it may be changing with the families where the father is the primary caregiver, which we now have so many families that somebody could do some research on that.
Yeah, and I mean, that was not
You know,
really known, I don't think, in Bowen's time. You know, and so, you know, or I think you talk about gay couples, you know, they're two men or they're two women, you know, and how, but I think that idea might change about who absorbs who's the predominant person who absorbs the anxiety and transfers it to the child. But I think the relationship system is still a part of that. Yeah,
There was
you-
a tiny space in one of the Bowlby quotes that you put up there, where he said mother figure,
Right,
which would be the answer to the Obama situation and,
right,
and some
right,
of this discussion.
right.
Yeah.
No, I think
Although
that's
Bowen's
correct.
view was bigger, more avenues for the forces to travel, not just one.
Did you have something?
Okay, Bowlby's talking about the baby's development. I mean, is this, so this is the first, 6 months, year? What does breastfeeding have to do with it, or not breastfeeding? And when does the father start to really be also, more prominent in Bowlby's attachment theory versus Bowen?
Well, in all of my reading, I never saw much about, there's one reference he makes to the extended family, which I thought he must have, I mean, it's like a paragraph, but he really, and I, this 20-pound book, I think people have written many articles about, theorizing about attachment theory that go beyond where Bowlby went. But Bowlby did not talk about the father.
What were, to the extent you know, both gentlemen's relationships with A, their mothers, and B, their fathers? How connected were they, et cetera? Did they have a conflicted relationship? Was mother out of the picture for 2 years or for some reason, for good or bad?
I don't know enough. I mean, if you want to read, Bowen wrote a whole chapter about his family.
Who did?
Bowen wrote a whole chapter about his family. But I don't really know. I don't know about exactly Bowlby's.
Did they ever, they certainly had to know about each other.
Well, they never met, so I don't know.
But did they communicate somehow? I mean, not email, they both died in 90, but letters?
No. Mm-mm. Not that I know of. But, I was going to ask Dr. Mike Kerr, who was around with Bowen early on, if he knew anything, because I'd be interested in knowing that. But there's no written material, no letter, no anything that.
Did Dr. Kerr respond to your inquiry or anything, or not at all?
Well, I haven't asked him yet, so I'm going to ask. So, yeah.
Just a comment that Bowlby's approach to all of this is more a dyadic relationship that he's relating to, whereas Bowen's approach to it is the triangle and multiple triangles, but clearly the primary triangle of the father, mother, child, and they might weigh differently in that triangle, but they're all related to the emotional process that's constant. That's the way I think about it.
Well, okay, let me just go on, okay, and then we'll, so Bowen went on to develop in his theory, so he's looking at family anxiety. What are the variables in family anxiety? And he has this idea, which I just mentioned, about the triangle. So what he's saying is that the relationship of the mother to the baby can be moderated by the relationship of the mother to the father. And that is called the primary triangle. So that if the mother and father are having difficulties, I mean, this would be an example, and they're having difficulties handling that difficulty, the mother may say, have you noticed that Johnny's not very popular in school? Aren't you worried about that, to the father? Then the mother and the father can manage their anxiety or their tension between each other by both worrying about Johnny. So then you get, that's one example of a triangle. So you get a family where the management of the anxiety is handled by the projection on the child. Or the mother can sympathize with the child and the father can be on the outside, or vice versa. So that tension can be managed in triangles. A second way that, a second mechanism to handle tension is by severing the relationship. So the family doesn't have any relationship with their extended family. And that often is seen as a benefit. Like, I don't have to talk to my toxic mother. But Bowen would say that effort to not deal with a relationship in the family, also you pay a price.
Also what?
You pay a price for severing the relationship. You lose resources, you lose connection, you use the capacity to have the child have a relationship with the grandparents. So there's a price that a family pays. And, you know, many dilemmas with child abuse have to do with an isolated mother. I want to have time to talk, to have some. So this cutoff leads to fragmented families, and it often intensifies the worry, the focus on the child. So, you know, if there's a mother-child relationship, the father is cut off from the mother. There's not, you know, the triangle to some degree in the human family, if you don't get along with your mother, you can go talk to your dad. You know, and dad may say, you know, buck up, or do, you know, just do the best you can, or let me give you a hug, or, but when the relationship is only between the mother and the child, or the father and the child, then there's less flexibility, there's less maneuvering room for the child developmentally. That the mother and the father may not agree, but the child has the experience of having different relationships with different people. And so another powerful way of managing tension in a family is projection. And Bowen felt that the most important projection was on the child. So the mother or the father would say, I think something's wrong with Johnny, and let's go to the pediatrician and just see if that cough could be asthma. And then the child gets tested, and then the child gets diagnosed as a learning disabled child, or, you know, that was a way of the family managing anxiety. And this did not mean that the parents should not be actively engaged with a child, or looking out for their realistic needs. But projection would be the sense that the parents are relieving their anxiety by projecting it on the child. So it's not being inattentive or you know, the parents say, what's wrong with Johnny? And then Johnny picks up that, you know, the parents are worried, and then he does something, and then the parents respond to that, and let's take him to a psychiatrist, let's do this, let's do that. And then finally the child ends up with a diagnosis, which then the parents can get a lot of helpers to get involved around. So the overall idea is that this family system has a powerful impact. The relationships in this family system have a powerful impact on this mother and child. And that if you don't look at the family system, you cannot really understand how the child is developing. You take Obama, for instance. It wasn't his mother, it was his grandmother. And that's true for many children. You know, it doesn't have to be your mother, but you need someone who is interested in a continuing, ongoing way, usually. So the developmental of the child has to do with the family system, who's there, who's capable of addressing the needs of the child and the needs of the mother, and the needs of the mother. So, and it's not, so what is child abuse? We just had a whole discussion here at the Bowen Center. Someone who heads child abuse was presenting about her work. She heads a child abuse center in Baltimore. You know, the dilemma with child abuse is the mother or the father cannot separate themselves out from the child enough to be appropriate to the child. That's the dilemma. You know, if you do this and you embarrass me, I'm going to smack you. Or if you do this and make me feel uncomfortable because you're running around the house, you know, I'm going to swat you. Or whatever. And so the mother has a difficulty, or the father, the father has a difficulty in being enough of a self that I am the parent and I don't need to just react to the child. I can manage myself. I can self-regulate in relation to this child. And when the mother is too, you know, what's the difference between the feeling of the mother and the feeling of the child, the emotions of the child? And that is where, you know, the mother gets into trouble. So an example that I give is the mother and child leave the house and the mother says, "Put your coat on. It's cold." And Johnny says, "But I'm not cold." And that would be, you know, the mother not having a way to distinguish what she's feeling from what her child is feeling. Okay. So the question, so I want to open this up for discussion, but the question comes and is all over the developmental life cycle of the child, is what happens when children come from fairly horrendous homes and turn out okay? What's happening? You know, and there's all kinds of ideas. There's, what is his name? But a man in New Mexico, psychologist, who says, well, they're dandelion children and they're orchid children. Dandelion children can just deal with anything. Orchid children are very sensitive and they will respond to difficulties in their life. You know, that's one idea. But what are the mitigating circumstances to where children from abusive alcoholic families, I mean, I used to work in the field of addiction, grow up to be very capable. You know, they run corporations, they have successful families, you know, and what makes the difference? And, you know, they have the same mother, and the mother is not necessarily one who promotes secure attachment. So that's one of the questions. And Bowen would say, you know, that you have to look at the bigger system. You can't simply look at the mother. You know, there's all kinds of ways that a system can compensate for a mother who's not capable, not real capable.
If the rest of the system is fairly healthy.
Well,
If it's a family of alcoholics, then who's going to help the child who's stuck because the mother's not?
well, I mean, those are the variables. But it is very interesting that families can have symptomatic people, and the family can be operating at some level in a very capable way. So but you know, you need to look at the system. The other thing he says is that development takes place over a lifetime, and that, you know, I'm trying to think of an example right now, but, you know, a child could have a difficult childhood, and the family can settle down and become more stabilized, and that can mitigate. Well, I can think of someone in my family where, you know, there was the husband in the family had an addiction problem, and so then the family got divorced, and the mother went on, and the father did better, stopped using. The mother remarried to a very stable person, and the child is doing beautifully. But during the first few years, there was some turmoil. So he's saying it's not that it isn't influenced by childhood experiences, but Bowen would say it's not determined by childhood experiences. Okay, so the final point is that in Bowen theory, the idea isn't you go and tell a therapist about what you think has been, how you've been mistreated, but you use the coaching experience to talk about how to re-engage with the family to the degree that is possible and become more capable of managing yourself in the triangles, the challenges the family has, and that it isn't just talking about it to somebody, but it is actually going back and managing yourself differently. And there are many aspects of coaching that I, don't have time to go into, but the basic idea is that the work is up here, of going back to that family, understanding what happened. I mean, there's very few parents that don't want to be good parents, but they don't always, able to do what they love their children, but they don't know how, or they haven't grown up in a family where they could experience that themselves, or they knew how to do it, or circumstances affected them in a way that they didn't do a very good job. But Bowen would think about that as immaturity, as the incapacity to handle anxiety, not as purposeful, most of the time. I mean, I think there may be exceptions, purposefully hurting the children, but simply the incapacity to do a thoughtful job. And any of us who've been parents know there's been a few times where it's like, really, you did that? So, and that if you can go back and reprogram in your brain those relationships, you have more of an opportunity to not repeat them. And I mean, I worked in the field of addiction, and a lot of times people would grow up and say, I do not want to be like my father. And then they turn out just like their father. And it's not they're not motivated, it's more they just don't know how to be different. So anyway, I'm very interested in any thoughts or ideas you have about Bowlby, about Bowen, and I'm not saying Bowlby's wrong. I mean, Bowlby is very, very influential. But I think he and Bowen were doing something different. Yes?
My thoughts have been going, as you speak, to the ability of a maturing child to seek outside influences. I had the perception, as I had the opportunity to fraternize with good friends' parents, in other words, be temporary part of other families, that I was seeing alternate ways of organizing a family. Could you speak to that possible effect? Phrased differently, you mentioned early on the infant's way of regulating the family. and then as the infant grows substantially older, the infant may, or the child may have a way of regulating the unit that it takes family influence from.
Well, my experience is that, I have learned Bowen theory over the years, and then I talk to families. And my experience is the family has a fairly profound impact. But that's not to say that a coach or a teacher or a minister or a friend's father wouldn't have an influential role. There's this longitudinal study that NIMH has run about the influences, the protective influences toward middle school children. It's a longitudinal study. And what they found was that the important variable in violence across socioeconomic groups against violence, it wasn't against pregnancy, but drug abuse, school truancy, and there was one other problem that teenagers had to do with the continued interest and engagement of an adult. That was the important variable. It wasn't where you lived or, your ethnic background, your ethnicity. Thank you. See, I need the group to help me. Those were variables, but nothing as profound as an adult that was interested in the child. And that can be a grandmother or an uncle or, but I think it's usually a family member. And you know what, I did a presentation on the Hillbilly Elegy. I don't know if you've read that, C.D. Vance, but he sold millions of books. But he's a guy who grew up in the, the hollows of Kentucky, or his family came from the backwoods of Kentucky. And they were a wild bunch. Uncle Van had the biggest marijuana, sales in the county. But it was his grandmother. His mother was a drug addict. Trying to remember what happened. He had she had 8 different husbands or boyfriends. But his grandmother was the variable, and he grew up he went to Yale Law School and is now kind of goes around the circuit. But that was, and he says, it was my grandmother. So I think it can be outside the family, but generally, or it can be a foster mother. But generally, I think the family has a pretty profound impact.
There's another one that I've just read, Jeanette Wall's book, The Glass Castle, and that's very descriptive of a similar situation. And your description of the 2 men who developed their ideas in somewhat with some things that are compatible, but then other things that are very different. It plays out in that story so well. It's a wonderful book to read. She did a good job of writing it up. The movie
See, once you get into family systems, almost, so one of our faculty members was doing this presentation, and she did a family diagram of the family on This Is Us. Are you familiar with that?
Which author, the Glass Castle's family?
No, This Is Us is a TV show on NBC, and they have all, there is adoption and biracial, and there's just a lot of different aspects to it but it's still, the point is it's a family. Emotionally it's a unit. Well, let me just see if anybody else has any other thoughts, comments, questions?
You made a comment not long ago about, when you were talking about coaching or working in a Bowen Systems way, about reprogramming your relationships, is that the phrase you used? And I thought it was interesting, the Bowlby and maybe more Freudian or psychoanalytic derived mass of psychological stuff leads towards what's pretty much, you almost put it up there, corrective emotional experience, that I have a relationship with the therapist and we investigate all these things that happened and that I can progress beyond that. But it's not like Bowen theory, but it's another angle to the concept of reprogramming. But it's very intrapsychic and interactional. And that's one of the ways that I understand it. Whereas with Bowen systems theory, you have a much bigger field, but your result is you're still looking to change the way you interact with people and forces in the system.
Well, you know, I'm not a great person to talk about individual therapy. The way I do think about it, though, is it's kind of like learning how to play tennis. You know, you can talk about tennis, and you can learn the rules,
Yeah.
and you can have a good coach. But if you don't play tennis, I mean, going back and trying to relate to your family differently is like learning to play tennis. It's learning to operate in a way that you didn't know how to operate before. And so, I mean, I think that's the power, you know, but obviously I'm here, the director of the Bowen Center, so I'll tell you what I think is helpful. I mean, but then people say, well, I can't do that. You know, they're too difficult. You know, and that's the complexity of it. But the power is that if you can go back to what it was that imprinted you, there's a lot of power in that. You know, if you're, well, I mean, I'll tell you the story out of, so we had a faculty member who retired, and her name is Roberta Gilbert, and she wrote a number of books about Bowen theory. And in one of her books, she wrote Extraordinary Relationships and the 8 Concepts of Bowen Theory and Leadership. So she's written a number, I think 6 or 7 books. So she said, you know, when she was in psychoanalysis, and she said, you know, I would get these periods of depression, and I just wasn't making any progress. So I heard about Dr. Bowen, and I decided to come and study with Dr. Bowen. And what I noticed is that I would go home and my father would be very critical of me. And he'd say, Roberta, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Gilbert's a psychiatrist. You know, I don't understand, you just don't do this right. And she'd say she'd come back from a family visit depressed. And after, I think, a few years of working at this and trying to understand her father, who was a minister, she said they were walking around the lake one day, and he said, you're doing it, you just are doing it again, you're doing it wrong. I don't understand why you can't do it in a better way, blah, blah, blah. And she said she turned around and said to him, well, that's just your view, Dad, but I love you. And she said after that, I'm not trying to make that's the technique, but that was an expression of her capacity to be in that relationship and not come out deflated. And she said after that, her depression pretty much went away. You know, and this would be, I think, the power of our primary relationships in our family to both sustain us and to challenge us. Mm-hmm.
You talk about the dangers of conflating Bowlby theory into Bowen theory. what are they? I mean, it's, if they're so similar, how do you, I mean, obviously one's more individual focused and Murray Bowen sees the whole family as a system. What are the dangers of conflating Bowlby's attachment theory into Bowen theory? What are the pitfalls?
Well, I mean, I think that is probably, you know, a useful question. I just have portrayed them as different. I have portrayed them as different.
Okay, right.
And if you conflate them, then you're not really understanding either one of them.
Okay.
If you mix them together, you're not really understanding either one of them. You know, I think there are lots of implications. You know, Bowen does not think that, you know, lacking a secure, in fact, I think he would say that sometimes what's defined as a secure attachment is really an over-focus on a child. A lot of the, you know, a lot of the schizophrenics that he saw in his research at NIMH, it wasn't that the parents weren't totally attentive to the child, it's that they were totally attentive to the child. And the child, I think anyone who's seen families knows you get these entitled kids who, you know, who think their parents owe them whatever they want, versus the child having the capacity, you know, to overcome challenges, to think through solutions to problems, and that, so this secure attachment can be as much of a problem as it is a solution. And so I don't think Bowlby has any way of really talking about what do you do with a family where there's not, where the family is abusive or neglectful, or, I mean, he does not really have a way of talking about how a child can turn out okay.
They both read widely. Isn't it possible that one would have read the work of the other, or vice versa, you know, somehow?
I don't know, it's possible.
I mean, isn't there any, you know, well, I guess, in his volume of letters, he didn't correspond with Bowlby?
Not that I know of. Well, I don't know. Are there any other questions? I appreciate you coming tonight. I know, you know, we're into the holidays almost. But it was helpful for me to kind of study this and try to define it.
The three...
Just any other, yeah.
Yeah, when you talked about going back, you know, to your family and operating differently, go back to what, you know, imprinted you originally, how do you do that with your parents aren't living anymore? I mean, you have a bunch of siblings, then you can go back and do some work there, but is that as and your parents aren't living, but doing it with your siblings, is that just as good as doing it? I mean, if your parents weren't living, I mean, or were living?
Well, that's a complex question, and I think that people best do that with coaching, and you know, where you can talk about and diagram your own individual family and have a strategy. But what I would say, the overall thing that I think Bowen talks about is that the multi-generational family is what he called a family field, a family emotional field, and that I think it can be harder when your parents are dead, but there's a lot to learn from one's family and a lot of ways of trying to understand it. And that
Asking questions even of other people that are.
yeah, and you know, the thing about families, at least this is my family and it's a lot of families I see, you know, my family just repeats patterns. And this is one of the things that Bowen says, is that if you go back 2 or 3 generations, you will see exactly what you see today. And how does that, help you think about this is like the family's like an ongoing organism, that goes down the generations, and you're a cell in that organism, but it's a bigger thing. So what you do today, you may be doing slightly differently than your grandmother or your great-grandmother, but there's probably a part of you. A few years back, I went and I saw my cousin who lives in a way different, my first cousin. And I hadn't seen her for 25 years. And we sat down together. And it's like, I totally knew who she was. And she totally knew who I was. Because our fathers did so many of the same things. That like, get out of town and don't ever go back. They lived in a little small town in Indiana. So, it was present, and how she lived her life and what she did had a lot of parallels with mine, even though I didn't really know her. So the family has patterns and ways of operating, that aren't just your mother and you and your mother and your father, although that's a very powerful way. Yeah.
There's another resource too. We had a speaker a while ago who talked about doing family research after her mother, during her mother's lifetime. But it was a family with significant cutoff. Her father had died when she was small in the Korean War. And she used people who knew him that were part of his war experience, as well as other friends and neighbors. And so that's another perspective, because they all have a different aspect on that one person that you're trying to get to know in their absence. There's a lot of information in the relationships that were held with that person that open up opportunities for discovery.
Yeah, and let me just put a plug in. So if you're interested in Bowlby, I will refer you to the attachment people, because if you're interested in Bowen, let me just mention that we have an online course where you learn more about Bowen theory and you can receive coaching. We have a postgraduate program for people who are, want to apply this in their family and their work. We have these meetings, we have clinical conferences. So there's on our website, there's a lot of different ways to get more deeply engaged and involved in Bowen theory if you're interested. So thank you for coming tonight. You're a great audience.
This is archived on Facebook somehow?